Here we go. All right, so have out in your notes, we left off by looking at legitimacy. I feel like we've done a decent job of talking about the kind of circumstances of legitimacy with regard to national security. It's important for a government to keep foreign invaders out. Check. Domestic security. It's very important for a government to have a handle on crime and keep people from killing each other in their own country. Check. Economic social satisfaction. It's really important to the extent that the government can try to provide for a system so that people have got jobs and they're meeting their expectations. But it does get harder when people's expectations go up and the economy is having some difficulty. I hope that in your lifetime you're economically and socially satisfied, because that really sucks if you're not. It's no fun to be dissatisfied. But it is more of a challenge perhaps for people in this country because we have had a lot of success. But there's been some ups and downs too. And right now we're kind of in a little bit of a precarious, challenging thing with how COVID is impacted. Okay? Next thing, write it down. Freedom. All right, let's focus on the freedom part. This is the one where I made the argument that people love freedom, but when they're looking at their government, they might have different expectations depending on where they live and what the history has been in that part of the world. If there hasn't been much of an expectation for freedom in that part of the world, it's probably because they haven't had stability, some prosperity, some things that have helped to kind of calm things down, and then people are like, great, the government's taking care of this, security, and everything's fine. Okay, now let's have some of that freedom. Come on, government, let's have some of that freedom. Let's be specific. Write it down. What are some of the kinds of freedoms that people may look to and say, yeah, I want some of that, and I want the government to help me on that? Choice of what? I don't know. Freedom, what kinds of choices? I mean, because freedom to make choices. I'm just asking for some specifics because there's lots of different choices that one could make. What would be an example of some? Perfect. Freedom to choose your political leaders. All right, you like that? That's definitely part of a democracy. Freedom to choose your political leaders, elections, and things like that. Good. Freedom to speak on all kinds of things, whether you want to talk about politics before, during, after the election, or you want to talk about just whatever. Freedom of speech is a really big one. In our Constitution, when we got through the Constitution, which we're going to be studying, it was like, whoa, we forgot to put something in there. Guess which numbered amendment protects for freedom of speech? Yeah, Uno, 1. Yeah, there's lots of important things in that First Amendment. But yeah, First Amendment, free speech rights. Good. Another one. Yes? Freedom to have like privacy, control over your house and your person, your belongings. We're going to check on that. Okay? We're going to check on that. Are you okay with the police checking into somebody's house if they have a warrant, reason to believe, backed up by perhaps some evidence, that inside that house is criminal activity and things like that? You're okay with that? That's part of like the domestic security. So we want to have personal freedoms and we want to have like security and privacy in our house, but do we want that for the criminals to be able to have that all the time? And actually, it's like a freedom of security. It's like a privacy thing. Fourth Amendment, when we get to the Constitution, we'll look. Fourth Amendment says your right to be secure in your person, papers, and property from government interference unless they've got a warrant. And we'll get into all the details as far as what is going to be required for that warrant and all those situations. It's really interesting and so forth. But I'm glad you identified that because those are some big ones. You guys are doing really well on these.
So along the lines of social are taxes technically complete that because they're taking the money?
Okay, well, we're talking about the freedoms and so forth. It's interesting because if you want the security, national security, we're going to have to pay for a military. If you want the domestic security, we're going to have to pay for the police. If you want economic and social satisfaction, we might have to pay for some programs to help people who are like unemployed or, certain things like that. That requires some tax money, Trey. So that's what you see. Just because taxes are collected from people doesn't necessarily mean that that's like a repressive form of government and people don't have freedom, okay? All kinds of governments can tax. And that's basically to pay for those things that we need in government. Basically, okay? But it is interesting because if you don't like the taxes, in our country, that protects freedom. You can speak out. Let's hear another one.
I actually have a question.
Okay.
How come, like, we can't just print out money and give it to the military?
You just want to print out your own money and give it to the military? That would be counterfeit, and it's, we'll look at the issue of money. Yeah. We kind of do that sometimes anyway. It's like, I don't know, we're just going to print more money. I mean, here's the deal. Shh, real quick. If you print more money than you can actually support and so forth, what's the value of that money? It's not much. And so what happens to prices? All of a sudden, you got lots and lots of money that you're paying in order to actually buy stuff. So it's complicated. The quick answer is, yeah, you want to be very careful if you're the government in what you print. And we do not let individuals just print money. Okay, guess what? Other freedoms.
I don't know if it's just for like kind of America, but I would say freedom of happiness.
We actually have that in our Declaration of Independence. Pursuit of happiness, I would say, you can write that down. The freedom to pursue what makes you happy. Okay? The original connotation was like pursuit of like property, which could make a lot of people happy and secure and so forth. Thomas Jefferson expanded it to pursuit of happiness. And it's a little bit more broad, but it could apply to like personal freedoms and choices and entertainment. And just, yeah, I mean, yeah. I like that. Good. Yes, so write that down. Freedoms within the judicial system, within the court system. So you don't just get dragged to court and like told you're guilty and so forth. You have all kinds of freedoms to represent yourself, to have attorneys. So those are very, very important rights that we have. Anything else that you can think of just like the top of your head? Yes? Other freedoms.
Right to not be imprisoned or
Good, right? Right not to be a slave, right not to be in prison unless there are charges that have gone through the whole criminal justice court system and so forth, and you had a trial and so forth. Yeah. Religion, freedom to choose to participate in a religion or not. Now, as we go through the year, we're going to be coming back to these, and we're going to see, for example, there are some limitations on those religious freedom rights. So if somebody wanted to practice a religion and just stop and say a quiet prayer to themselves, I mean, is the government going to stop that? I mean, should the government stop that, or is that okay? What if they're like, I'm feeling that Aztec religious feeling coming over me, right? I've used this example all the time, so some of you guys heard this before. And I need to raid the neighboring village and grab all these people and take them up to the top of the pyramid I built out in the back of my house and offer their torn hearts from their chests to the gods. I think we can put a limitation on that because the freedom of that other person to use that heart as a beating vessel inside their body over trumps my religious freedom and practice to practice Aztec religious worship services. Okay? But that's an interesting analysis, yeah. Oh, protection, right? Second Amendment. That's the Second Amendment. The right to protect yourself. And we get into the whole gun debate. If you carry around a gun, is that all about your protection or other people feeling threatened? I mean, depending on who you talk to at whatever time and so forth and place, it can get very interesting, those debates. When somebody shows up and says, I'm here to participate in a political debate, should you feel threatened? Actually, if they cock the thing and go, then that actually is kind of threatening and so forth. But if they just got it packed on the side of their body, I mean, it's like, well, that's Idaho. I was always fascinated because this year we don't have foreign exchange students. But foreign exchange students come over and their laws tend to be much more restrictive as far as gun ownership and practice and so forth. And they look around, and I'll do this to them. I'm like, raise your hand if you got a gun in your house. And then the foreign exchange students look around and they're like, ah! And I'm like, but it's America. It's an interesting debate. And it is one of the rights that's protected in the Constitution under the Second Amendment. Let's do a couple more.
Freedom of speech and not wanting to speak, kind of like Fifth Amendment.
Yeah. Oh, what do you mean the Fifth Amendment? Oh, he's getting all constitutional on me, right? He's got the Fifth Amendment. There's all kinds of stuff in the Fifth Amendment. What part of the Fifth Amendment are you talking about? You don't have to answer that if you really don't want to. If it will that's it, isn't it? The right to remain silent. Go ahead, you can talk.
So when you get arrested or basically aimed at police, they review your rights. That's the Fifth Amendment right. Right to remain silent. Right to
An attorney, that's in the Sixth Amendment. And then we'll find out later on there's a Supreme Court case that actually says if you're being arrested, you also have the right to be informed that you have these other rights. It's the Miranda rights and so forth. We'll be talking about that. Very good. Very important. So in a difficult situation like you're in custody, you do have the right to remain silent. The government can't just like torture you until you squeak like a tube of toothpaste with information that's going to help them to convict you in a court of law. How about the right to choose to hang out with what you want? Like get married to somebody who you want to or not. The right to choose like what job you want to go into. Now those kind of fit into that whole pursuit of happiness-y sort of thing. Those are personal choices, and those are things that people like to have. How about the right to kind of like travel freely in this country from place to place to place, right? You hope that there's something that's not overwhelming that like we have to put we have to put a curfew on a community at night. I mean, can you imagine the circumstances where some communities have had to say, I'm sorry, we just can't have people out after 9 o'clock because domestic security. We've got too much rioting going on in that community, right? So we have reduction of a certain kind of freedom in order to gain domestic security results, yeah.
The right to leave the country.
Now that's an interesting two-part one. You got the right to leave, but it's one of those leave and arrive go together. You leave and then you arrive somewhere else, and that's going to be up to that other country as to what the rules are for you arriving. It used to be really easy to leave the United States of America and go to Canada. I remember when I was your age, you didn't even need a passport. And then you needed a passport to go to Canada. And now they're actually pretty restrictive. Why would they be restrictive on Americans going into Canada? No, it's not the guns. It's the COVID. Yeah, it's the COVID. Right? Because there's certain areas in this country that are hot spots because sometimes people are doing things in their own personal choices. They're like, I got my freedom to breathe the air. And even if, whatever, you know what I'm saying? Right? And so if you get a high rate of COVID in that area, other countries are going, yeah, you could just have your little freedom, nasty COVID thing going on in that little area. We're not going to let you come in here because we see you as a high risk. And so that's kind of what's been going on in the world today. If a particular area, country, community has like a high rate of incidence of COVID, other countries might say, I'm sorry, we're not going to let you travel here. And we started that off too. I mean, in the early COVID days, we saw big outbreaks in places in Europe as well as China. And so we put travel restrictions on those two areas. What comes around goes around. Some of those areas of the world are now looked at the United States and said, hey, you've got it worse than we do. We don't want you coming to us. So you do have a right. You've got a right to travel freely within this country. Once you go into other countries, then you have to like check in to see what the issues are there. Mm-hmm. Hawaii was really concerned because they get a lot of tourists from the United States as well as other countries, and they're hoping not to get it. So that's why they were like trying to kind of keep things in confinement. So there's lots of very important freedoms, huge, big issues. I tell you what, we spend a lot of time on civil rights and freedoms and the protection of those freedoms as we go through. And I think you're going to get an understanding as we, particularly when we get into our next unit, authoritarian governments. You ready? Next thing right here, major types of government. Major types of government. Boom. In a lot of these types of government, there isn't necessarily much respect and provision for freedom. It varies. The ones that typically don't provide much for freedom, their argument is, hey, we got enough problems in our country dealing with national security and domestic security and economic issues and so forth, so, you know, whatever. Too bad, freedom, you know. Just buck it and, you know, just mind yourself. And it's tough because in those countries that don't have democracy and protection for freedoms, there's not much you can do. I mean, you go up to Adolf Hitler and I don't really like the way you're running your government. I mean, exactly, yeah. I mean, hello. He was not one. I mean, in this country, you can say, President Trump, I don't like exactly how you're running your government, right? I mean, he can't, like, take you out or anything. He will, you know, depending on who you are, he will respond back in kind, probably. He'd be like, tweet, I don't like JT either. You know? No, I mean, if you did that, or if you were like, if you said something positive, he'd be like, JT is awesome, you know, hashtag JT rules, you know, kind of thing like that. So, but I mean, that's American democracy. It gets wild and crazy and so forth, but there's so many freedoms that are part of it. It's aggravating at times, but it is not like some of these other countries' and governments that we look at that don't provide that protection. Yeah, if you went to North Korea and you started complaining about the government, thank you. Yeah, JT's got the, the visual down, which I think that works out pretty well, okay? All right, so, by the way, here, relationship between geography and legitimacy, where geography helps you in national security, domestic security, or the economic social satisfaction. It's like, yay, I'm Norway. I've got mountains and fjords and oil and so forth and good allies, and it's good. But some of the countries, geography and history, following up, don't necessarily make it easy for a government, okay? So I think we've made those points pretty clear. All right, now let's get into the major types of government. You ready? 1, autocracy. 2, oligarchy. 3, democracy. Boom. Those are the 3 major categories. You see it on the handout? Perfect. So I'll give you very quick definitions of each of those. Yeah?
I thought autocracy was just like all ruling, but among it was totalitarian, dictatorship, monarchy, and oligarchy.
Yep, yep. So the big definition, you ready for autocracy? You ready for the definition? One person rules. That's the overall definition. One person rules. Autocracy, one person rules. Yep, that would be a good example. No, Donald Trump is a president within a democracy. He is the most important individual democratically elected leader, but he does not possess all the power, and I would say even most of the power personally. A lot of political power is spread out within the federal government and also the state governments, and who's got like authority over a lot of the decisions affecting like this charter school? The local government, which is the North Star Board. Okay? So, what? Am I complaining about the government? Okay, quickly, yes.
So would that mean a constitutional monarchy would not be?
We're going to get into all those things. Yeah, in fact, that's why I put it in democracy. Okay? Are you ready to spell out the differences among these? Okay, first, autocracy. It comes from the Greek. Aut, one, auto, one. Okay? One. Cracy, the rule. Rule by one. Cracy is the root of that, is like democracy. You heard the word democracy? Anybody know what the word demo, the root demo means? People, yeah. The people rule. Democracy. Okay? Autocracy. One ruler. So we've got 2 major types of autocracy, and I've got them right there. And we're going to talk about both. The 2 different types of autocracy throughout history, absolute monarchy, and then totalitarian dictatorship by one person. I'll give you examples of that. But the first overall category is autocracy. One person rules. Have there been times and places where just one person has ruled in some country? Sure, yeah. I mean, all kinds of places. Okay? Now, as far as generally what we're going to say about autocracy, let me make this point clear, okay? One person makes the rules. And there is one example, absolute monarchy. That's the oldest form. You can write that down. Absolute monarchy is the oldest form of autocracy. A king, a tsar, an emperor, a sultan. I don't know, what are some other really cool titles for those ones? A queen, yeah. I mean, empress, right? Okay, yeah. Quickly.
Then when did it change to like having a permanent? Like
It's going to vary over time. Here's a quick answer. So like, for example, if you have, listen carefully, it's a good question. If you have a country that has, let's say, a monarch that's ruling, and over time, things are stable, like Britain, for example. Things are stable. They've got national security. They're not getting invaded. Domestic security, things are pretty peaceful in the country. Economic social satisfaction, a lot of people are doing okay. What's starting to take deeper root in that country during that time of stability? An expectation of freedom from the people. And who do they expect it from? From the government. So Britain is a very good example of where stability over a long period of time has helped freedom to thrive. And when you have more freedom, then we're going to get into that third group of governments, the different types of democracies. Right? And I'll just give you a real quick one. It has been pointed out correctly by Noah that a constitutional monarchy, while it looks like the old absolute monarchy, it's actually not. It's like Queen of England. Everybody know who the Queen of England is? What's her name? Elizabeth II. Although if you're up in Scotland, it's the very first Elizabeth to ever rule over Scotland. So they're like, we're not those two, because there was never an Elizabeth I ruling. Anyway, whatever. She's a constitutional monarch. Who has the real power in Britain? The monarch? No, who? The parliament, which is elected by the people, exactly. So it's like a democracy, but they still have sort of a leftover monarch. It's like they never clear their closet out. I don't mean to be rude or anything, but it's like cool. It's like, hey, we can still have a king or a queen and have democracy and have freedoms protected. In fact, the reality is, by the time of the American Revolution, you remember this from last year? By the time of the American Revolution, who had most of the power in Britain? The king or the parliament? It was the parliament, yeah. So even by that time in history, the king didn't have as much power, and even less so now. Quickly.
So what does the, like, nation was like a representative of the country?
Yeah, people look to her. I mean, it's like sort of the leader, the good example to her people. And that's constitutional monarchy. We'll get to that more a little bit later on. I got some more stories on that one. But for autocracy, you've got the absolute monarchy, and then in modern times, you're going to see the totalitarian dictatorship. All right? So let's say some things generally about autocracy. All right, here we go. First, the one person is ruling. Okay? Now, by ruling, what do I mean? You ready? Here's one thing. They make the laws. Okay? They make the laws. So they have that power to make laws. I'm the king. This is what I decree. This is what happens. Okay? I mean, Louis XIV in France. Some of you guys might remember that. Louis XIV says, everyone has to be Catholic. And if you're not Catholic, leave. Whoa, king can do that? If you're an absolute monarch, you have the power to make the laws. Next, you have the power to enforce the laws. Now, it's really hard for a king to be at all places and all times and so forth. So who does the king hire to carry out that enforcement? All kinds of things, like police, and the courts might work for him. So that enforcement component is very important. The king is the boss. Makes the laws, enforces the laws. Oh, and if there's a question as to what the law says, write this down. Interprets the laws. The king also interprets the laws. And like, let me clarify on what I meant. That was not what you said yesterday, but I'm the king, and what I say today matters when? Today. And tomorrow, unless I change my mind tomorrow. And you better hope that I don't change my mind tomorrow, because what you did today that might be okay won't be okay tomorrow, and I'll look back and say, you should have known better. Now, what you did that you thought was okay, well, I'm the king. I have all power, exactly. I'm the king. I have all power. All right? Who does he use especially, or she, to carry out the authority behind this rule? Military and the police. Write that down. Military and the police. Okay? That helps them to do that. All right? Next easy question. Are they elected? For the most part, no. Well, how do you get to become king? Yeah. Okay? So it is hereditary. We'll get to that in a sec. First, it is hereditary. You're the king. The king is dead. Long live the king. Weird. The king is dead. That means the prince takes over for the king. Or in the case of Henry VIII, one prince became king, and then he didn't have any kids, and then his sister, and then when she died, it was Elizabeth I. You get to be the monarch. Okay? Hereditary, not elected. And, put this down, most absolute monarchs have kind of a religious component to it. The justification for the king gets to rule is that is what God intends for this country and for the people. God has put this particular leader in power, and therefore don't mess with God, therefore don't mess with this king. Understand that? It's called divine right rule. If you read the chapter, you probably ran across that, didn't you? You did get that question right. Nice.
So can a king or queen retire?
That's a good question. The answer actually is yes. And it happens more often now where they don't have that much authority. Sometimes they're like, I'm not feeling real good, and they'll retire and give power to like the next generation. Like, for example, someday, Queen Elizabeth II, I mean, she's as old as my mom, and so they're both like 94 years old. And I know that's kind of a tough job. And so I wouldn't be surprised if at some point maybe she resigned, perhaps, from the full job and then handed it down to her son, Prince Charles. Or another alternative is She just can't do the job as much. She still holds the title, but a lot of those responsibilities are carried out by her family. So, okay. Good. It's the most common one in history. You replace after somebody dies. It does not exist much today. Write that down. Absolute monarchies hardly exist anywhere today. Saudi Arabia is like one of the last examples where they have like a royal family, and there's a lot of maneuvering within that royal family over who actually gets to hold what position, and sometimes uncles and cousins and brothers get put in jail. Ooh. But I mean, if you look at the history of absolute monarchy, that happened there too. I mean, the British history is like, oh, these princes are supposed to be the next in rule. Ha ha, says Uncle Richard III, and he kills off his nephews. Whoa. So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of intrigue and so forth going on there. Okay? All right, now, yes?
Wait, so it's what, if there was a daughter, that was the youngest, like the youngest?
Depends on how the system is set up. Historically, they tend to prefer males. Okay?
Well, I mean, what if, like, the daughter were to kill the son, and then the king and the queen, or whatever?
Question is, did they get away with it?
Well, what would happen then? Like, you kill the whole family, so what would you do?
I mean, that happens. Sometimes you get like a king's family and they get killed off, and then somebody else comes in and goes, I'm the king now. It's like, well, what do you have to support that? Me and my army? Okay, you're the king. Okay? So you could have a king killed off and the family killed off, but that system of government is what people are used to, and so somebody else comes in as the king. It's like Catherine the Great. Somebody remember that story? She wasn't even born in Russia. How did she get to be part of the Russian royal family? Anybody remember? Yeah. She married in, and then how did she get to be the empress? She did. She killed her husband. He was an idiot. What's that? She had him killed. Yeah, she didn't have to do it herself. Yeah, he was killed. There were other people who wanted a strong leader for Russia. We'll actually come to this again when we do, because we're going to cover this. They needed a strong ruler for Russia, and she fit the bill, and he didn't. And so other leaders in Russia were like, let's, support her, and let's kill this person. And yeah, so yeah, we'll remind you of that because that's going to come up again in the story of Russia. Okay, now, let's tell you about dictatorship. You ready? Dictatorship. Totalitarian dictatorship. When you see the word totalitarian, think modern and think total. It's even more power unto one person than like an absolute monarch would be. Because even in the days of like absolute monarchy, some absolute monarchs, you can write that down, some absolute monarchs would let you, say, have religious practice. Okay? They might. They have freedom of religion. And they might give you certain freedoms within the country. But in modern times, and this probably really helps you to figure it out. 200 years ago, how would an absolute monarch, a king, know what was being said by the people? How would they know? How would they know? Spies, yeah. I mean, they have spies. They have to have a good spy network. And they did. I mean, they tried to kind of keep it. Today, if you're a modern dictator, do you have the technological apparatus to really like listen in on large things and so forth that the people are doing? It's crazy scary, yeah. Write that down. Yeah, I mean, that's like modern. It's almost scary. You're like, with more technology is more freedom. If you're in China, I mean, they have facial recognition systems. They've got listening devices all over. Oh, and they also have traditional spies. And yeah, it's really, 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 really hard. Yeah. Totalitarian and what? I'm telling you. Okay, a couple things. First, totalitarian is much more modern, like say within the last 100 years or so. Absolute monarchy is earlier. Okay? And I'm going to tell you some further differences. All right, here we go. Very good question, because this is right where we're at. In a totalitarian dictatorship, there's even less freedom. Even less freedom. The government is just like into everything. Now, there's a lot of similarities, like who's making the laws? The dictator. Who's enforcing the laws? The dictator, plus his military and police. Who's interpreting them? The dictator. Yeah. Here's one of the big differences. It's not necessarily hereditary. So you can put that down. Okay? So like when we look at the Soviet Union, communist dictatorship in Russia and the areas that they control, The first leader was Vladimir Lenin. The next one that's going to come up is Stalin. Or actually, if you know Animal Farm, the first one was like Old Major-ish. And then came Napoleon, right? And then, I mean, does it pass down to the next generation? Not necessarily. So in totalitarian dictatorship, it doesn't necessarily go to the next generation, okay? So there's not that sort of like, in fact, totalitarian dictatorships usually don't have that whole divine right thing going on that a lot of absolute monarchs do. I mean, especially the Soviet Union. They're like, do not believe in religion at all. So they're not going to be like, well, I'm divinely, entwined. There is one example. Let's see if you can figure this out. There's one example of a totalitarian dictatorship where there's power in the hands of one, and it's tended to stay in the family. And so we've got grandfather, father, son. Yep, North Korea. Yeah, North Korea. It stayed within the Kim family. And actually it's interesting because the son, he's not that old. His health is not that great, and some people think that he might actually be dead. And then who does power go to? Does he have he doesn't, I don't know if he even has any kids. Maybe if he does, they're little. He's got a sister? Could his sister take over power? He could. Yeah, sure. Why not? I mean, really? Do you think the difference on whether or not somebody uses nuclear weapons in a warfare thing is like gender tied and so forth? No. How many of you guys would feel safer if the North Korea was under the controls of a guy? How many guys will feel safer if North Korea was under the control of a girl? How many guys are like, I don't feel safe either way on those ones? It's like, yeah, I mean, it's like, what the heck? So anyway, so those are some examples. Did that help as far as like some of those ones? Think modern total helps you to understand it's like more control over all these various different things. Okay? Oh my gosh, are we? Sorry. We're done. Yeah. Time flies when you're having fun talking about dictatorship.